So now we're moving on. And I'm not sure, we are supposed to have another in-person speaker, but I'm not sure whether she is here. I guess not. Let me just read off the name. Okay, so Camille Fulavka is not here, and she is not online. Okay, so if that is the case, then we'll switch to the next person. We might just need to check whether she is online right now. That would be Junyi Chu from the MIT.
Hi.
Oh, okay. Hi. Yeah, sorry for pushing you forward, but I guess you are ready. Okay, thank you so much. So this is Junyi Chu from Massachusetts Institute of Technology, and they'll be giving a presentation entitled "Because I Want to: Valuing Goals for Their Own Sake." Junyi, you can take it away.
Okay, thanks so much for that introduction. So hi everyone, my name is Junyi and I'm a final year graduate student at MIT. And in today's talk, I'm going to show you some exploratory new work done in collaboration with my advisor, Laura Schultz. And overall in my dissertation, I explored the ways that goals are valuable for human cognition and looking at how they can support thinking and planning. And I do focus on children's play, but this is a foray into decision making, so I'm looking forward to some questions and feedback. And I would like to start with a story about parking cars. So I don't like parking, especially not parallel parking. But this British man who dreamed of parking in every spot at his local grocery store made an announcement on Twitter about a year ago. So he took about 6 years to park in every single one of 211 spots at his grocery store. And I can't see the audience reaction right now, but I'm sure you have many reactions. And it turns out that the Twitterverse also did. So some people thought, well, he must have been quite bored to pursue such a quest, remarking on the rewards, or rather the lack of rewards that are associated with this quest. And others were quite fascinated. They wondered, what was his method? What costs were he willing to incur? Perhaps did he ever get to a point at the end where there were very few spots left and he found all of them occupied? So in that case, was he going to wait and take on that time cost? And some others remarked on the inefficiency of his plan. So why not just go late one night when all the spaces were empty and just complete that in one shot? So what were some of the constraints that were involved with this goal? So regardless of what you think about this, whether you think this was a boring expedition or some kind of creative pursuit that led to some personal joy, I think this event raises some important questions for cognitive science. And in particular, I'm curious about why are we the kind of thinkers who would come up with such an arbitrary goal that has no clear rewards? And why would we be the kind of actors who could not only decide that these are worthwhile pursuits and take on all the associated costs, and especially so when there are alternative goals and plans that are probably more rewarding and even less costly, right? So why did we choose to do these things? And I think this is an important question because on the surface, it seems to violate the principle of rational action. So throughout the literature, and I'm sure throughout this conference, you're going to see evidence that adults and young children, even infants, they both maximize expected utilities for themselves and they also expect others to do so. However, there are also many cases where people seem to adopt idiosyncratic goals and almost intentionally violate practical utility. So in a recent review that we've worked and some experiments that we presented at CogSci last year, we discussed how this kind of behavior might be a defining characteristic of play, especially children's play, but possibly adults as well. And we also wrote a little bit about why this playfulness might be helpful for flexible thinking and learning in humans. But in today's talk, I'd like to focus on one other observation that comes out of this phenomena, which is the fact that after people have chosen a goal, they're often reluctant to reconsider it. Instead, people often press forward with their initially chosen goals, even when other preferable alternatives are available. And this kind of decision inertia shows up not just in these idiosyncratic contexts, but also many everyday behaviors. So here are two examples. One is the phenomenon of the sunk cost fallacy, also known as throwing good money after bad. So for example, when entrepreneurs have a failing business, it seems that the more they've already invested in that business, the more likely they are to increase their future investments and actually try to expand those businesses. One other example is in doctors' treatment decisions. So in one review of clinical visits, they documented so-called clinical inertia, where doctors were kind of biased to continue with their initial treatment plans. And this led them to fail to intensify treatments even when their patients were clearly responding and their health was clearly getting worse. So why is this? Why do we do this? I think it's quite puzzling, and I want to explore that with you today. Okay, so the question is, why might we be so attached to our goals, whatever the consequences are? So there's been a few explanations in the literature. One of them is perhaps we're not as rational as we thought. So people make different choices all the time, and perhaps an aversion to losing or wasting our initial efforts, or a misplaced optimism about future outcomes, all of this might lead to perseveration behaviors. We might also be sensitive to social factors, such as hoping to maintain positive reputations, or perhaps our own self-concept that we already made the right choice initially. And Yashing Liu's talk about affective factors, I think, also are really important here. We might also be trading off the expected rewards against some computational costs of evaluating the alternatives and generating new plans. Maybe the cognitive control idea could be present here. And last but not least, perhaps it's a virtue to be resolute. We might have learned from others or from our own experiences to really value effort and persistence. And so some philosophers have argued that without this capacity to maintain our goals in the face of new costs or other attractive goals, we would just end up continuously distracted and we would never accomplish anything. So I think these are all really great accounts of the consequences of sticking to our goals or of switching to new ones. But I do think they miss a motivational component. So if you talk to people who embark on such quests, or if you watch documentaries of mountain climbers, one common answer for why they do what they do is because they want to. So I want to propose today that perhaps in addition to normal considerations of utility, goals might have an intrinsic value that drives us to pursue them independent of the particular content of the goal or the consequences of success and failure. And I want to come back to what this means in the discussion, but for now I'm going to share with you some initial experiments testing this possibility that we find value in goals. And we're going to test this by asking whether adults and young children persist with their initial goals even after they learn that it will be quite costly. Again, this is preliminary work. I'm going to also share some ongoing and future directions, so I'd love to hear your comments by email, Twitter, any messaging platform. Okay, so how did we go about this? First, to differentiate this from the sunk cost literature, we're going to look at participants' choices to start working towards their chosen goals before they've actually put in any effort or action. So it's not a question of whether they decide to continue or if they decide to escalate their investments, but simply if they would choose to pursue that initial goal or if they would switch away from it. And to differentiate this from some resource rational accounts, we're going to present participants with just two options to compare, and they're going to have very straightforward costs that are visually obvious. And because most of the literature on the rationality of this sticky behavior has been in adults, we wanted to test in young children in the same paradigm, and specifically 4 to 6-year-olds, because there's some intuitions that might be mixed here. So on the one hand, we might have anecdotes of children really caring about getting their way, which might lead to temper tantrums and so on. But on the other hand, in research, we've got abundant evidence that in the first few years of life, children are already quite sensitive to cost and rewards, and they expect both themselves and others to make more or less rational choices. However, a recent study has shown that unlike the adults, 5 to 6-year-olds don't seem to anticipate that people will make the sunk cost fallacy. So it's possible that young children don't view sunk costs as wasted and that they won't be as sticky as adults. Okay, so today I'm going to present 2 experiments and some discussion. And I'm going to start with the first experiment to test whether adults and children might actually be sticky. And so first, because we wanted to use a similar task for children and adults, we started with the child task here for 5 and 6-year-olds. And we ran this entire task on Zoom. So children were home and they actually had a lot more distractions than they might have in a lab setting. And our first challenge was to come up with goals that children would really care about. So we came up with 4 trials where on each trial participants choose between 2 characters who need help. And we tried to match each pair of goals. So for example, here you'll see 2 children, they're both shivering, but one is cold from the snow and one is wet from the rain. Or we have some kittens here, they're very sad, but some of them are hungry and some of them are lost. Okay. And we also wanted the costs to be real for children. We didn't want them to be paying money or tokens, but we wanted them to expend actual effort. So we're going to use a drawing task, and we created some low-cost, easy drawings or some high-cost, difficult drawings for each goal. So here's just one set of stimuli, but we counterbalanced sort of which goals had easy or harder choices. Okay, and this is how the task worked. In the familiarization trials, we showed children some pictures, and we said, if you can copy our drawings exactly as they look, then it's going to transform into our magical storybook. So we had children practice on this, and we took a screenshot and transformed it into a cartoon image on the screen. And we also had some inclusion trials where we asked them to correctly identify which of 2 pictures was easier or harder to copy. And we only included data from children who correctly answered both questions. Okay, so these were our materials. Now I'm going to show you the experimental manipulation. So in our critical condition to measure goal reevaluation behavior, we first showed participants 2 goals, and we asked them who they want to help. After they make this choice, participants see the actual costs, but we rigged it. So if their chosen goal was, for instance, here the lost kittens, they would see that costly action paired there, but if they had chosen a different goal, we'd switch the action costs. Now participants are asked again, are you ready to work on that initial goal, or do you want to switch? So the dependent measure is how often children stick to the high cost action. And we contrasted this critical goals first condition with a control condition in which participants had full information of the goals and associated costs when making their choice. So we simply showed participants the information step by step and then presented a final frame for the single choice to make. And again, we counterbalanced which goals were shown first or which goal had the easier action. And here we predict that participants should rationally minimize the cost of acting. Okay, so in experiment 1, we had 30 children in each condition, and we predicted that participants in the control condition should choose the harder actions less often than chance, but that they would increase that behavior in the goals first condition. And that's what we found. So using a mixed effects logistic regression and controlling for individual and trial level variations, we found a significant condition effect. And in both cases, the average preference is different than chance. So I think this result is a bit striking because it suggests either one of 2 things. So one possibility is that children do recognize and they do rationally consider the costs, they just choose to ignore them in that goals first condition. Another possibility is that children do consider the costs, but they sort of override it because of this high value placed on their already chosen goal. And since the only difference between conditions is whether children had initially chosen the goal or not, then it suggests that in this case, a very simple sort of pointing or choosing was enough to enhance that intrinsic value assigned with that goal. And I'll note we did explore other possible factors, but we didn't find any significant effects of story or age, at least in this sample. Okay, so next we brought the task to adults as a Qualtrics survey advertised on mTurk, and we modified here how the costs were manipulated. So again, we wanted to involve actual effort, but since it was a survey, we just showed adults some simple repetitive tasks. So they might have to search for items in small versus larger grids, or they might have to click a button 5 versus 20 times, or copy a short or longer sentence. So these costs are, again, very straightforward to assess, but it does place a real time cost on participants. And on mTurk, this real time translates to real money. Okay, as before, we compared choices in the 2 conditions in this between subjects design with 4 trials per participants. And it turns out that adults responded very similarly to children. There is a condition effect, and in both conditions, the responses differ significantly from chance. So I take this first result as initial evidence that people do show some inertia in sticking to their goals, rather than switching to a lower cost but equally valuable alternative. But there are many reasons here why people were not switching. So we did reduce sort of the cost of evaluating these options but it's possible children have a real cost to switch. So this is some of what I've been talked about in maybe a reconfiguration cost. So in experiment 2, we wanted to test if children were indeed capable of switching. And so this time, in addition to increasing the cost, we wanted to reduce the value of their goal. So this is how we did it. We ran this experiment as a within subjects comparison. Participants completed 2 of the goals first trials from experiment 1, but they also did 2 goals devalue trials in alternating sequence. And the goals devalue trial was a small extension. After showing all the goals and the actions involved, children learned that actually another child has also chosen to help the same animal, and they already finished drawing. So that animal already got help. And now do you want to keep helping the same animal, or do you want to switch? And so in this case, we predict that children should switch to help the other drawing and to help the other animals. Okay, so here were the results. We found a significant effect of trial type. So it's not that children cannot switch goals. They do switch more often on the devalue trials. But strikingly, however, children were still sort of inclined overall to persist, right? So in this case, they were not different than chance, and it was higher than in the experiment 1 goals plus cost condition. And as a caveat, we did pre-register these analyses, but we still need to recruit and test another 11 children, so these are not the final results. But let's look at adults. So here's the data from adults, and we actually kind of find a very similar result. There's a significant condition effect. They tend to switch when goals are devalued, but not significantly different than chance either. And this was actually pretty striking because in order to devalue these goals for adults, we actually directly showed them a picture of the completed goal where this puppy has gone down a ladder and is very happy and is home, and someone else has already helped them. Okay. So in summary, it looks like we do find some preliminary evidence for this goal persistence behavior. Participants do seem to switch if the goals were no longer meaningful, but they still had some tendency to stick to them. Okay, so I'd like to move to discussion and summary. The first discussion point is whether this is limited to a sort of altruistic context, right? Or perhaps children were affected by the presence of an experimenter, so there were some social or reputational pressures present. So to address this, we're planning some new studies with less pro-social, more individually focused goals, and we're going to use lookit.com to run some asynchronous studies with children so that there's no experimenter present. I do think, however, that this explanation might be less plausible for adults, in part because there's some recent work by Xiaozhe Chen finding that adults display this sort of sticky behavior even in a very pared-down grid world navigation task. Nonetheless, I do think it's an interesting possibility in its own right if we do find sort of a context influence. Now, suppose we find that this behavior generalizes to different tasks or situations. The next question is, what's happening here? And as noted, the resource rational accounts offer one plausible explanation, and I'm quite sympathetic to that, but I find it a little tricky to explain the adult behavior because there really were very minimal costs for assessing or comparing the plans. But it's quite possible for children and worth investigating here. But I'd like to propose that one additional explanation, which is this additional value of goals in helping to scaffold thinking and planning, which are very hard problems for us because there's a vast space of possible thoughts and plans. So to illustrate, consider a drawing task. You know, if I give you a blank page and say draw something, you might get writer's block or drawer's block. But if I say, you know, draw something to help the kittens, it gets much easier. You can imagine what you might want to draw. And this works even if the goal is quite arbitrary with no particularly rewarding content or outcome. Okay, so I want to propose that perhaps merely having a goal, even when it's arbitrary, could be valuable by giving us things to think about and things to plan for. And this might also have downstream sort of longer term consequences for human innovation. Okay, and it also opens up questions of whether goals might differ from each other in terms of their value for planning and their value for thinking, and how humans might be sensitive to those differences. And so finally, I just want to say that this isn't about pursuing costs for the sake of it. Instead, if what we value is the goal itself and not the challenge, then we would expect people to be sort of conditionally efficient with respect to their adopted goals, which means we predict they should only incur costs that help to achieve those goals. So if two actions equally achieve our goals, we predict that children and adults should choose the easier version. And a related observation is that in play, the behavior and goals that we come up with can simultaneously be arbitrary and idiosyncratic, but also quite constrained and efficient. So we do have some preliminary work that I'd love to talk with you about this. But because of the time, I'm just going to end and thank everyone for listening, as well as acknowledge the incredible undergraduate researchers who've helped to collect data with the children. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you for the great talk. Okay, let's see if there are any questions in the live audience. Okay, yeah, there is one question.
Hi, Junyi. Thanks for the talk. Just in terms of those arbitrary goals, or one of the arbitrary goals I do is try have fun. And I was thinking about the kids who were doing the drawings. I wondered, did you have any metrics of how much fun they were having when they were just drawing on their own? I imagine the M-Turkers weren't having fun typing words or doing grid searches, but the kids might find their drawings fun inherently.
Yeah, thanks for the question. So we have a few measures, but they're not very great. And I'd love to think of ways to better measure this in our future experiments. So for the children, at the end of the experiment, we asked them, how much fun did you have overall? Was it a little bit, medium amount, or a lot? And most of them say a lot. Some of them say medium. I think one or two said a little bit. So overall, they seem to be having fun. For the M-Turkers, I didn't ask them how much fun they were having, but I did ask them to leave any final comments or answer an optional question about what they thought the experiment was about. And so going in, I expected nobody to fill out this question because it was an optional question at the very end and they weren't getting paid for it. But I actually had a lot of responses saying, I think you were looking at decision making. This was kind of a fun task. I'd love to do another one of this. So I was quite surprised by that. So I'm not sure that adults were not having fun entirely. Yeah.
Okay, and I have another question. So could you comment on how this squares with kind of traditional exploration literature in children versus adults? And are there any differences when you're just choosing actions versus when you're thinking about that in terms of goals?
Yeah, so it's the question about just comparing this task to the explore, exploit kinds of tasks.
Not necessarily, but if I remember well, the kind of common results is that children would be noisier and more explorative overall, if I'm remembering that correctly relative to adults. And if I'm interpreting the results correctly, you see sort of similarities between kids and adults here when it comes to goals.
Yeah, definitely. So I think you're right that there is some evidence out there that children behave a little bit more exploratorily than adults, at least in the kind of information-seeking tasks. And that can lead to different downstream sort of learning behaviors. In this case, it wasn't really an information-seeking task, perhaps, right? They knew what the tasks were, they knew what the different drawings could be, and we do find very similar behaviors between children and adults. Yeah. So I'm not quite sure you can make the parallel. But in other work, we've looked at designing a task for measuring free play. So instead of being given two goals, kids and adults sort of have to come up with their own goals and plans and so on. And we haven't quite fully done the analysis comparing children and adults, but adults can be quite playful, actually.
Okay, great. Do we maybe have any virtual questions?
Yes, we have. So this is a question from Francisca Brundle. What do you think would happen if participants don't choose goals themselves, but you would assign them one of the two goals? Do you think they would still show the same behavior in the experiment one?
Yeah, thanks, Francisca, for that question. I think that's a fascinating question, right? So how much of this comes from because it's the personal choice versus the simply having of a goal? And I really want to do that experiment. I think both outcomes are possible, but I would love to bet on that even in the being assigned condition, one conjecture here is that the value comes from having something to think about. So perhaps once you're assigned a goal, you start thinking about it or perhaps even simulating some plans. And if that's what's valuable, it's possible that people wouldn't even switch in that condition. But I do think it's an empirical test that we could find out.
Thank you. So this is the second question from David Manager. If the goals have intrinsic value, what will be the source of the value? Could we assign that value quantitatively to compare against other goals?
Yeah, thanks so much for that question. Yeah, so I alluded to that a little bit at the start, but I'd love to brainstorm a bit more here. So one hypothesis here is that there is certain information in a goal that helps you to plan and invent new sort of ideas or explanations. So if you have a question, there's information in it that tells you what makes a good answer. So perhaps more generally for any particular goal, you have some information in it that tells you what makes a good plan for it. And I think I would love to test if people are sensitive to that. And I think there should be a way to quantitatively measure that. And here I think the idea is that in addition to sort of costs and rewards, we're also thinking about constraints, right? And actually in the art world, there's this idea of creative constraints. And so certain kinds of things, by adding these constraints, can actually make you a bit more creative. So I'd love to try to find a way to formalize that.
Do we have the time for the last question?
Yes, we do.
Okay, this is from Yaxin Liu. Great talk, thank you. Related to your first discussion question, what is the role of context in evaluating goal? For example, something too costly so that escape behavior can happen during the goal evaluation process.
I wonder if, let's see, I guess I'm a little not sure what the escape behavior refers to. If Yaxin is around, if you could help clarify that a little bit. I do think context matters. I just want to understand the question a bit better.
Oh yes. So what I mean is, so kids can give up even before trying.
Right. So maybe the moment, right. So in this case, we show them the actions before they start drawing, and do they already sort of give up even prior to that information? I guess I'm thinking about whether this is related to things like the inhibitory control and delay of gratification literature. But actually, in thinking about our study, I actually have the opposite problem where children can't wait to start drawing. So they see the picture and they're like, oh, that's really challenging. They don't even seem to, they look at the pictures, obviously, but they already start drawing before I finish saying like, oh, and do you want to switch? And so, and maybe that's an inhibitory control issue as well, perhaps. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. That's a very interesting observation.
Thanks for the questions.
Okay, great. Thank you so much for the talk. And yeah, I think that concludes today's sessions. Thank you all in person and virtual audiences. And yeah, have a great rest of the conference. Thanks.